Let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech, right to assemble, right to petition, right to religion, freedom of the press. Collectively, those freedoms are called the freedom of expression. So 1804 People v. Croswell case had shown that the truth is the best defense against libel and slander. So people are saying, oh, you lied, you didn't say, you said that thing about me and it wasn't true, which is libel, which is slander. And there's some threshold. You can't slander, you can't libel people. But if somebody accuses you of doing so, then all you got to do is say, well, it was the truth. Rex v. Zinger, 1735, that also says truth is the best defense against libel. The Garrison v. Louisiana, 1964, says that malice doesn't factor into it. Only a disregard for the truth is the basis for no First Amendment protection when it comes to libel and slander. And then there's the 1964 New York Times Company versus Sullivan. In that case, said to be hit with libel or slander, the lies must be intentionally and maliciously stated. So if you just look at Garrison v. Louisiana, 1964, New York Times Company v. Sullivan, 1964, they kind of say two different things. One says that you can only get hit up with libel or slander if you just have a complete disregard for the truth. You had no regard for the truth, it didn't matter, and therefore you libeled and slandered. New York Times Company versus Sullivan, 1964, says no, not only must there be a lie, not only must there be a disregard for the truth, but it must be maliciously stated. So if the person didn't intend for it to be malicious, but it came out that way, it's got to be intentionally and maliciously stated for the New York Times Company v. Sullivan, 1964. So they all say the truth is the best defense against libel and slander. The Garrison v. Louisiana case, 1964, says malice doesn't factor into it. It doesn't matter if you print a lie, with hateful intentions, or you printed a lie just because you had no regard for the truth. That's the biggest thing. Having no regard for the truth whatsoever. That's Garrison v. Louisiana, 1964, and not having having a disregard for the truth and maliciously stating the thing. So the intention matters with the New York Times Company v. Sullivan, 1964 case. Two other court cases, Texas v. Johnson. In the Texas v. Johnson case, it proves that in America you're allowed to burn the flag. Burning the flag is just fine and dandy and absolutely consistent with the First Amendment. And Texas v. Johnson kind of proves, the point. There's really no better way to celebrate America, right? A country that celebrates freedom and unpopular speech. That's according to the Supreme Court. You could burn the flag, and that's consistent. You're protected by the First Amendment. Texas v. Johnson. Texas also has another case called Texas v. White. And this doesn't have to do with free speech. It's a fun little case. It says that secession is unconstitutional, but revolution, or with the other state's permission, that's the only way an American state can secede out of the Union. So if you can get the permission of the other states, or just outright revolution, then you can secede. There's Texas v. White. That's the only way. Secession by itself is unconstitutional, but if you do it by revolution, or if you get the other states to, sign your permission slip, then you can go ahead and slip on out of the Union. All right. So now the New York Times versus U.S. 1971. This is the Pentagon Papers. This revealed that a claimed threat of national security was not justification for prior restraint on publications of classified documents. The Pentagon Papers, the Vietnam War, 1971. This is a Warren Burger court. It's going to be a 6-3 decision. And the Supreme Court quickly ruled that the First Amendment gave the New York Times the right to print the Pentagon Papers. There's no prior restraint in America. We got the freedom of the press. 1971, 58,000 Americans had already died in Vietnam War. Well, it wasn't a war. It was never actually, declared a war. So the Vietnam police action, 58,000 Americans died in the police action with The conflict with North Vietnam been going strong for at least 6 years. Truman started it, but 60s and 70s is when it massively escalated. In 1967, Robert S. McNamara, he's some cabinet member, commissioned a massive top-secret history of the U.S. role in Indochina. So one of the cabinet members of Nixon's, 67. That was before Nixon, actually, wasn't it? So it was 67. That's LBJ. McNamara was with LBJ. Anyways, McNamara commissioned a massive top-secret history of the U.S. role in Indochina. 1971, the New York Times had obtained a copy of the McNamara Internal Defense Department report that detailed government discussions about the war. These confidential documents would become known as the Pentagon Papers. 1971, U.S. military analyst Daniel Ellsberg gave copies of classified documents to the New York Times. Senator Mike Gravel, bawling his eyes out, read the Pentagon Papers into the Senate record. And then the Pentagon Papers, it detailed a top-secret Department of Defense study of the U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The Vietnam War cost more lives than U.S. government said that it would. And all the presidents involved, starting with Harry S. Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, they all misled the public about the Vietnam War and our degree of involvement. So this is a 1967 report, and then eventually it's going to be finished. Eventually the people are going to find out about it 4 years later. So that's, another 20,000 Americans who were killed. So the purported crime was that the New York Times was publishing classified material when they were not authorized by the federal government to have that classified information in the first place. A federal district court, at the U.S. government's request, issued a temporary injunction ordering the New York Times not to publish the documents, citing national security as a concern. This is all the elements of the Julian Assange case. So the New York Times appealed, arguing that prior restraint violated the First Amendment. And it does. It's America. There's no such thing as prior restraint in America. Daniel Ellsberg had actually helped produce the report. He leaked 43 volumes of 47 in total. It was a 7,000-page report to reporter Neil Sheehan of the New York Times in March 1971, and then the paper began publishing articles outlining their findings. So that's the crime. Daniel Ellsberg took 7,000 pages and gave it to Neil Sheehan, and it was just a general report about basically the history of the Vietnam War, but it's classified, and it's about the military, and you didn't have the authority to use it and say it. So after that happens, New York Times is publishing. White House sends a cease and desist demand letter to the New York Times, requests the court to enjoin the New York Times to stop them like an injunction or restraining order, aka prior restraint, to keep the New York Times from publishing their articles. So Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1907 wrote that the main purpose of the First Amendment was to prevent all such previous restraints upon publications as had been practiced by other governments. In 1931, the court wrote that only the narrowest of circumstances, like publication of the dates of the departure of ships during wartime, were permissibly restrained. So you can't give up movements of the troops in the field. In 1969, John Marshall Harlan II wrote that the Supreme Court rejected all manner of prior restraint on publication. All manner of prior restraint on publication. So John Marshall Harlan II seems like an absolutist when it comes to rejecting prior restraint. Here's a great quote. Judge Gerfing rejected the White House's request for injunction, writing, "The security of the nation is not at the ramparts alone. Security also lies in the value of our free institutions. A cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. Fantastic. A cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press must be suffered by those in authority. So that way we preserve our freedoms, the right of the people to know. June 18th, 1971, the Washington Post jumps into the foray. The Washington Post starts publishing a whole bunch of the Pentagon Papers. And again, the U.S. government asked them to stop. And then the courts reject the U.S. government. The inconsistency between the New York Times and the Washington Post case led to the being here, but those cases being heard by the Supreme Court. Now, the Dennis v. U.S., the 1951 Supreme Court case, Dennis v. U.S., changed the threshold of danger, of how, dangerous speech to grave and probable danger. Before, it was clear and present danger. Now it's grave and probable danger, meaning the onus was on Nixon's government to prove that the New York Times publishing the Pentagon Papers represented a grave and probable danger to somebody, to anybody. The Supreme Court sided with the New York Times. They wrote, any system, this is the 1971 case, New York Times versus U.S., Supreme Court wrote about it, saying any system of prior restraints of expression comes to this court bearing a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. The government thus carries a heavy burden of showing justification for the imposition of such a restraint. The end result is that the New York Times and the Washington Post could publish the Pentagon Papers without fear of reprisal, protected by the First Amendment, the freedom of press. To get enforcement of prior restraint, the government must prove that the publication would cause a grave and irreparable probable danger. For example, you can't print the movements of soldiers in the field, disclose their positions to the enemy. William J. Brennan, Jr. wrote how publishing documents didn't qualify the publishing documents, the Pentagon Papers, what the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Justice William J. Brennan had argued they did not qualify as one of the three exceptions to the freedom of expression that was established in the 1931 case, Supreme Court case, Neer v. Minnesota. 1931, Neer v. Minnesota, there's a test that said you cannot have prior restraint unless one of three things happens. 1, it reveals crucial military information. 2, it contains obscenity. Or 3, it may directly incite acts of violence. It reveals crucial military information, contains obscenity, may directly incite acts of violence. And so, according to the Justice William J. Brennan, Jr., he said it didn't satisfy either one of those three-pronged tests. Therefore, the New York Times gets to publish this classified information. Potter Stewart wrote, in the absence of governmental checks and balances, the only effective restraint upon executive policy and power may lie in an enlightened citizenry, in an informed and critical public opinion, which alone can here protect the values of democratic government. So just like in America, when the three branches fail to check and balance each other, then it's up to an enlightened citizenry. An informed and critical public opinion can alone protect the values of democratic government once checks and balances has failed, according to Justice Potter Stewart. And then Hugo Black. Oh, man. So Hugo Black is going to write the opinion for the majority. The injunction against the New York Times should have been vacated without oral argument when the cases were first presented. Every moment's continuance of the injunctions amounts to a flagrant, indefensible, and continuing violation of the First Amendment. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press would remain forever free to censor the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and to inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. And paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people, sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. We are asked to hold that the executive branch, the Congress, and the judiciary can make laws abridging freedom of the press in the name of national security. To find that the president has inherent power to halt the publication of news would wipe the First Amendment and destroy the fundamental liberty and security of the very people the government hopes to make secure. The word security is a broad, vague generality whose contours should not be invoked to abrogate the fundamental law embodied in the First Amendment. The guarding of the military and diplomatic secrets at the expense of informed representative government provides no real security. The framers of the First Amendment, fully aware of both, one, the need to defend a new nation, and two, the abuses of English and colonial governments, sought to give this new society strength and security by providing that freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly should not be abridged. So Hugo Black, everybody, Hugo Black was saying not only is this, prior restraint on the Pentagon Papers bullshit, but every second, every moment that goes by that allows this, fucking insanity, this bullshit, as long as this bullshit of an injunction because of, national security, they had classified materials in the name of national security. This is all Julian Assange. You have all the elements of Julian Assange in this case. So I want to just end this off with that awesome quote by Judge Gurfein, Gurfein. He rejected the White House's request for injunction, writing that the security of the nation is not at the ramparts alone. Security also lies in the value of our free institutions. A cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. So there you go. That's 1971 New York Times v. U.S., the Supreme Court case, probably the most central Supreme Court case that relates to the Julian Assange affair. So yeah, just looking at the 1971 court case, let Julian Assange go. He's allowed to print classified materials as long as he didn't do those three-prong tests, right? In Neer v. Minnesota, which is 1931, but it kind of gives you some idea of what's allowed and what's not allowed. So did Julian Assange reveal crucial military information in terms of, military deployments? No. Is there obscenity? Was there, insight, directly inciting of acts of violence? No. So violence didn't happen because of WikiLeaks. There's no obscenity in WikiLeaks. The crucial military information is that there was war crimes and 2 journalists were killed and 2 children were shot up. So there's a video that's not crucial military operations or information about the operations in the field. It's about war crimes. So it's about the truth about how we're actually not there to save the people. We're there just killing the people. So it didn't reveal crucial military information, contains no obscenity, and it didn't incite any acts of violence. Let Julian Assange go. Jesus Christ, think about the many, many accomplishments of Julian Assange. So in Peru, he told the truth. The corrupt government got kicked out, and they got a brand new government in Peru. That's good for Peru. So when history reads Julian Assange, so it's like, okay, he uncovered this corruption, uncovered that corruption, uncovered this corruption, pissed off all the powerful people of the world. But he was a truth teller. And so now Peru is forever changed for the better because of Julian Assange. How many other things, that Reuters, that journalists, that, collateral damage video is, what people know most about him, but he's been, leaking stuff about a lot of fucking people, and it's, overall, it's a good thing, because the idea that the people can have no secrets with the NSA wiretaps, but the government can have all the secrets in the world, is backwards. Either everybody's got secrets or nobody's got secrets. So the government, it definitely needs to be transparent. The people have a right to privacy. But right now it's the opposite. The people have to be transparent, and the government has a right to privacy. That is our government, and we do have a right to know this stuff. So, yeah, that's a Supreme Court case, I think, vindicates and nullifies and acquits Julian Assange. 1971, New York Times versus the U.S. Check it out. Peace.